Hello and welcome to the show. We're here with Dr. Larissa Maier, PhD. We have a lot of PhD people on this show, and today it's a very special occurrence for us because we're talking about psychedelics to help treat mental health, which is a very new concept for some people. They've never heard of it. They say psychedelics, oh, war on drugs, all this bad, bad, bad. We lived in the 80s. And that's supposed to be. So we're learning now about these drugs, and we have on the show today Dr. Larissa Maier. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Todd. It's great to be here with you.
Great. So some of the things that we're talking about is basically the topic of entheogenic medicine. What is that?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a broad term because we on one side hear about psychedelics, and on the other side we hear about entheogens. And entheogens are basically everything is like derived from nature. Like a lot of them are plant-based or fungi that are growing that have certain psychoactive effects when used by humans or also animals. And that use is dating back to many thousands of years. But what is new is that Western medicine or people in the West have actually explored these kind of medicines or consciousness enhancement experiences just in the past like 50 to 80 years. And that has been a culture most and foremost also in Mesoamerica that has been going on for years. And one Western guy then got introduced to it by Maria Sabina and could really participate in one of the ceremonies in the 50s. And then he actually brought he got some mushrooms and also gave them to Albert Hoffmann, our Swiss guy who has also developed LSD before. And he was synthesizing psilocybin for the first time. And this is important to notice because when we now talk about studies where, for example, psilocybin or other components are used, for the most part, these studies are using the synthesized chemical components and not actually the plants. And what is interesting is that, again, like a lot of traditions and indigenous people have used these compounds for years and derived from plants, and everything is kind of natural, and they used it in community settings and rituals and retreats. And these kind of retreats are now also finding attraction in the Western world, so to say.
Great. So this is basically where spirit and science meet.
Yeah, ideally there would be a bridge between spirit and science. And every so often we see that in academia, the studies are randomized controlled trials with people that are coming into the lab, and eventually the room is maybe decorated really nicely when a medication is given, or for some others just with relaxing music, or some like to have an eye shade or something. But it's not really spiritual because it's still like science-based, and it's about that compound deriving an effect that is just in that setting. So they're basically studying the medicine without really looking at all the things that matter so much around set and setting. And there is a difference in between whether you do it in a healthcare setting or somewhere out in nature, in a forest, or somewhere in a jungle, of course. And if there is a big difference whether it's like a therapy just one-on-one with a therapist, or maybe another person who sits by, or whether it's happening in a group. And very often in the Western world, people say, oh, but I have to work on myself and this is about me, so I don't want to do it in a group. But then in a group setting, I mean, we are really connected to each other. We've seen that during the pandemic. So it's part of the healing that we also feel other people's emotions and their suffering, and that can contribute to it as well.
That's great. I want to go a little bit into your background, your master thesis and your PhD work, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. My master thesis dates back to 10 years, and this was about prevention of harmful drug use in party settings in the city of Zurich. So for more than 10 years now, like actually for 20 years, we have the option to test drugs at parties with a drug checking analysis, like both the purity and the content of the drug, not just the color test. But in Switzerland, you have a HPLC method where you really get information on how much of each substance is in the drug that you're planning to use, right in a party setting. And for 15 years, we have the Drug Information Center in Zurich. So people in Zurich right now can go on Tuesdays and on Fridays to test any drug. And on Thursday, there is another evening added where 10 people can submit a sample of cannabis, because recently we had a lot of synthetic cannabinoids in the cannabis, which leads to adverse effects or unwanted effects. So basically my master thesis at the time was looking at developing a questionnaire together with the projects that were active in the nightlife settings, where we can do a brief counseling, but at the same time monitor substance use and talk about trends across the years or about across the regions in Switzerland, because we have different language regions which are a bit closer to France, who are speaking French, and Italy, closer to Italy, speaking Italian, and the different regions also show different drug use trends. So that was really interesting work. And obviously it was really close for me, because at the time I was already a fan of electronic music, and drug use was very normal in my community. And for me, it was important to keep my people safe. And from that part, the PhD thesis, like that was basically just an opportunity where I jumped on a very new project where we said like, okay, let's also look at drug use or any kind of substance use for enhancement purposes. So that was looking at cognitive enhancement. And there, a lot of the US studies just looked on stimulants, but I said, are there also people who are trying to enhance their performance with alcohol, cannabis, or eventually hallucinogenic drugs? And so we looked into that more broadly, and also looked into the over-the-counter drugs that are available, and whether people really felt that their performance improved or not. And it was also very interesting, and the beginning of looking into microdosing, which is right now another big topic that we could cover, where people try to use drugs and enhance their performance.
Yeah. I can say personally that I have taken some performance enhancements, not today, just the regular entheogenic marijuana, which is really helpful. I only got into it late in my late 30s, you know, and I would say that's what the war on drugs did to me, as growing up as, you know, a young person in the 80s in America, and thinking that all drugs are bad. And, you know, so it was really much later in life that I came to it, that I let's say, was privy to try these kinds of substances and compounds. And I would have to say it was so much more effective than any of the pharmaceutical pills that had been given to me up to that point. And now my diagnosis was schizoaffective disorder. So, you know, a lot of times people say, oh, people with mental illness shouldn't take psychedelics and this and that. But I say hogwash. We need it the most. You know, and there needs to be more research so that there's less risk. And I think what we're here to talk about also today is harm reduction.
Absolutely. And I mean, harm reduction involves education. I mean, that's first and foremost what we were missing over all these years, because the prohibition of drugs really made it difficult to talk about not only the risks, but also the benefits of use that some people may experience. And there is a certain functionality of each substance for each person, and it's very individual and very different. That's also why it's very difficult to actually generalize things in academic studies, because one substance may work for one person and not for another. And that's also a criticism at the current media reporting that is really saying this is a silver bullet. It's not, because it's not going to work for everyone. And especially when we're also thinking further to very marginalized populations or people who are unhoused, it could be really beneficial for them to have an experience like that, to get a new perspective. But at the same time, if we put them back to their environment where a lot of resources are lacking, and they cannot move on and they cannot progress, and they still have a criminal record, and they still don't get a job or housing, then the overall situation will not be better. So it's not like a magical cure. And again, like a lot of the treatment that we see now and a lot of the studies are really looking into one-on-one treatment, And only now some of the studies or bigger apparatus are discussing about group therapy, because also obviously you can, it's good for, it's very cost effective, but it can really help people bond beyond just the treatment. And oftentimes, like, that's why the NA or the AA are so powerful for so many people, because they create a community and you have kind of a backup where you can have some social support beyond that, whatever your decision is. And the other concept, of course, when we are here and talking about AA, everything is very abstinence-based, and that may work perfectly for a lot of people. But at the same time, there are people who potentially could be in recovery from opioid use, from stimulant use, from a disorder, and still at times use psychedelics as part of their recovery. So that's another new concept that is coming up, that is discussed, and that obviously needs more attention also in research.
Yes, that's wonderful. How long should people wait until these life-changing compounds will be on the market? And I don't want to say on the market. I want to say, when are they going to be available to the public?
Well, for some compounds, it's easier to say than for others. For example, for MDMA assisted treatment for PTSD, the MAPS phase 3 trials, the first one at UCSF, my colleagues, Jenny and others have finished it. It's very successful. A second one is ongoing, and they estimate that by the end of 2023, MDMA would be classified or reclassified as a substance that can be used in medicine. But again, that doesn't mean that MDMA can be legally purchased for recreational use. And the question is it really okay to have this differentiation between recreational and medical use? Because a big group of people would say, oh, they're perfectly able to self-treat, or they may have a circle of friends, or even online psychedelic integration circles where they could potentially have an experience with a substance that is safe if they know what they're taking, in a dose that is like reasonable, let's keep it like that. And the question is really, who needs the use under supervision, and in what form would supervision be beneficial? And let's say for general people in America who've never heard of psychedelics, I think it feels very safe to have that in a medical context and in a healthcare setting. But then for other people who have already made their own experiences with some psychoactive substances, they may feel better to do it in their community or on their own. And when I talk about that, I also want to talk about racism, because obviously Black people and people of color generally have been harmed, or they have a mistrust in the medical system, and there is a reason for that. So for that, we cannot just say one size fits all. We have to look into alternative developments too, and what it means. I was also working on a bill on decriminalizing psychedelics in California with Senator Wiener and different stakeholders and groups that were involved. And there the topic of growing was also discussed, because, and whether there should be limits on personal amounts that someone can keep or grow or whatever, because there again, like some of the compounds and entheogens, some of them grow in nature and others can be grown on their own, such as psychedelic mushrooms. And a lot of people in the Bay Area have these skills already, and why would it be wrong for them to provide for their community? So I think community-based models could be great, and especially also thinking about politics, because what we see with cannabis in California, but also in other parts of the United States where cannabis production, retail, or sales are legal, we really see that there is like advertisement involved, and that obviously when advertisement and for-profit is involved, there is an interest in increasing the demand for these substances, and that's not naturally something we would want from a public health standpoint, right? We would want that the people who have a desire to consume these drugs or substances or entheogens, that they actually have access to it, that they know what they're getting, and that they can make more informed decisions for themselves. So that the supply is kind of meeting the demand that is there, but it's not creating a new demand. And that is very difficult with all the for-profit models and non-profit models, such as social cannabis clubs as we have in Europe, or just again, everything that's community-based are not really discussed. There is always an issue of accountability, but for me, that would be the focus, or that would be where the focus needs to be put on, like accountability. If we have people who are already providing for their communities, which is happening as of today, and a lot of retreats, and already on Instagram and other social media, you can find retreats. So they're obviously all making money from it. It's a legal gray area, but some people are operating there. And how can we kind of get to a certain point of quality control? For example, in the Netherlands, they have a guild of guides where all the guides are meeting together and actually also proposing things to the government together, just to be in a dialogue. But the question is in how far these things need to be regulated. And when it comes to amount of use or how much a person can possess, and prohibition in general, we can probably think that less regulation would be better for the health of the people who use the drugs.
Incredible. We'll be right back. No, just kidding. There's no commercials. So basically, we're talking about compassion-based care as well, right? And to focus on the U.S. also, people would say that these drug policies are even racist.
Yeah, I mean, I told you when I was doing drug checking work and my master's thesis, it was just like to reduce harm and keep people safe and healthy here in Switzerland. But as soon as I moved to the US in 2018, I understood that there is such a big additional component to that drug war, or the war on drugs, that was actually started or teamed by Nixon in 1971. There were others before, but they really declared officially the war on drugs. And it was at the time where a lot of Black people started smoking crack. There are different stories where it came from. Some even accused the government to have it, to brought it into these communities, but that doesn't matter. It was just really to criminalize people who use drugs. And at the same time, hippies or other people who were against the Vietnam War also fell into that category. So it was just a political instrument. And that has continued to cause harm, because when we look at imprisonment and mass incarceration in 2021, we see that obviously during the pandemic, some people were released, but before there were more than 2 million people in prison in America. That's like no other country. Obviously, it's a big size country, but at the same time, no other country has so many people incarcerated. And again, like there is a financial gain from a lot of the private prison industry. So we need to look at these links too. But again, Black people and people of color were disproportionately more searched for drugs, or still are disproportionately more searched for drugs. And you find them more often in prisons for drug sentences that are obviously oftentimes looking at simple drug possession. And that's really like not fair. And a lot of that has been discussed, and there is an Equal Act right now discussed in politics at the federal level that could help, and the MORE Act with regard to cannabis, where it's also looked at how can we look at more equity and get people involved, because that's another thing. Someone with a criminal record cannot just come out and participate in the legal cannabis industry. So there are many barriers and hurdles towards equality. And I think that should be the focus of every discussion or every regulatory discussion around any form of substance use.
Mm-hmm. How can we decriminalize nature?
Well, obviously you have a really good team around Decriminalizing Nature and local chapters all over the US. And I think it's nice to say that it's not just nature, but really it should be all drugs, because it's really random whether a person starts using drugs that are plant-based or not. It depends on their peer group. But I think Decriminalizing Nature has a really strong argument in saying that obviously we shouldn't criminalize anything that grows naturally, because it's there, it's nature, belongs to everyone. And for a lot of, for example, peyote is a plant that is endangered at the moment, and there is a conservation initiative ongoing, which is really important by the Native American Church, because they want to make sure that a lot of that this substance or the plant is like available for ritual use for the people who have used it for centuries, right? And at the same time, now Decriminalizing Nature is also pushing for more conservation initiatives that would actually maybe plant and make sure that the plant is not endangered for longer. And so it's very interesting to look at that. And more and more cities are moving towards decriminalizing nature or even other psychedelic plants. And again, the argument for decriminalization really goes to all substances, because by decriminalizing, we're just saying that the people who are using these substances are not criminalized. People can also use sugar or alcohol or other substances that are more or less healthy depending on the amount of use. There is always, like when we talk about problematic use, we have to talk about the amount of use, frequency of use, mixed use with other substances, and the motives for use ultimately, and the context in which use occurs. So there's so many factors going into that. And there again, it's not the drugs that are causing the harm, but it's the disconnect that so many people feel that are kind of coping with negative emotions with the substances. And if all people would be happy and then use drugs, we would not have any drug problems, right? Because people would learn to moderate because they want to be social in social settings when they have friends and so on. And these are really discussions we need to have more and more, that we can move it away from the drugs, but at the same time, taking this first step of decriminalizing basically all drugs in America, but also in other countries. And it's interesting because when I discussed this in Switzerland, for example, the need for that is not so high because technically it's informally already decriminalized. No one's going to prison, right? There are still some people who are fined for like possessing bigger amounts, where we can also debate, is that really a crime if you only use it for you or your personal mental health? But that there the discussions are different because again, like in the US, the mass incarceration based on substance use has been such a big impact for so many people, which is why there I think the movement to decriminalize is much stronger than in other countries.
Very interesting. What should people know about psychedelics?
Well, most important thing, drug setting. For no other class of substances, we need to consider the set and setting as much as we do here. And again, I mean, it's always good to know the drug, what they're taking. In the drug checking here in Switzerland, we also see a lot of different substances added, even on the blotters for LSD and so on. So it's really worth to consult the drug checking service if you don't grow it on your own. And with the set and setting, it's really, we discussed mental health before. Mental health can be really triggering, like whatever you feel in the moment can be enhanced. So negative feelings can be enhanced with psychedelics. That's important to know. And some people want to go in there and dive deeper, and with the right preparation and integration, I believe it's possible to do work. With different dosing schedules that can be discussed. Like not everyone needs like a normal or a high dose and the real psychedelic effect. For many people, that can be the breakthrough moment or the mystical experience. But then again, like why wouldn't we go for microdoses or mini doses if that works for certain people? Like we don't need to go to heroic doses. So that's again very individual, and ideally people can like try different doses or different settings with people who are like advanced or who can be guiding, or in a setting, ideally in a clinical study, if that works for them, where the setting is really standardized and the safety components are provided. And then the setting, of course, it makes a difference whether you take it during the day, at daytime, or at night. For many people, I would say, especially women, it can be more comfortable to try the first psychedelic during daytime, where they can see the environment, where it's easier to navigate. It can still be challenging, of course, but again, it's good to have someone with you who's like a trip guide. And also with Global Drug Survey, we put out a list of what to consider like the first time when you use a drug. But I think the most important is really that you're with another person that is experienced. Whether the person also takes that substance or not, that can be discussed. Different people have different preferences there. I think it's important, especially when using from a new batch, to actually just start with a test dose and not go for the main high dose. Again, like if there's no psychedelic effect this time, instead of redosing, it might be better to have another opportunity or another experience and intentionally go for that. And I think especially in the United States, people start using psychedelics earlier than, for example, in Europe. And again, that may change over the next years because now it's discussed more broadly, but they're discussing or they're using it earlier with less of a knowledge and oftentimes very unintentional or just to have fun or to get high or to party. And that's obviously a very different use. So if we could have like a center where people could have their first experience and maybe also use a questionnaire to talk about the effects and what they're feeling, just as like when you learn to drive, like maybe you have to get a test first or whatever, that could be super helpful. But obviously under the current system of prohibition, this is far away. And the age issue is a thing in the United States, even for cannabis and alcohol, we have the age limit of 21. And obviously people are for the most part younger when they have their first psychedelic experience. And so there we have to think about what projects could reach out to these communities to actually meet them where they are, just as we talk about harm reduction, that they also get the information, even though they're using a substance that is currently prohibited or even in the future regulated for use above at the age of 21 or older.
Mhm. Great. I want to ask you, if you're able to answer this, what is DMT?
Well, DMT is one of many substances that are causing a psychedelic effect, and it can be found even in a banana. But most and foremost, most people know about ayahuasca. That is also really strong, and that is a lot of people go into the jungle for a retreat and drink it. But then there are also a lot of DMT vape pens now, or people who are using different forms of DMT. And then there are other natural DMT products, DMT, which is derived from the TODD. That is also another whole conservation issue there. But most and foremost, it can give you profound psychedelic effects. It's very short acting, is about 15 minutes, and then you're basically back to normal, but you can go really far into space. And that's a substance that, for example, Rick Strassman has researched quite a lot. So there are great books that he has wrote that I can recommend for people who are interested in the material more in depth. But I think it's an interesting substance because it's short acting, but it's not so much researched in the mental health despair when compared to MDMA, psilocybin, or other substances.
Yes. My experience with DMT was that I went to what I would call the waiting room.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that experience that was like a reset for me. You know,
Yeah.
it reset everything. And I was like a new person after that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm just wondering, how can DMT be used in a therapeutic setting? And is that something that's on the horizon?
I mean, as I said, there are more and more studies looking into it, but I would say even ayahuasca for treatment of depression is currently more research than DMT just on its own. Although, again, Rick Strassman was the first one who was able to actually give DMT to healthy participants in his studies and come up with some things. And I think that compared to other substances, I don't know whether why it's been like not really researched recently, or why it's not like part of the big discussion. That would be a question for Rick, definitely. But I mean, most of the DMT that we see is again inhaled. And for most of the medications that are synthesized, they try to give the medication as a pill or eventually as an injection, which would also be possible. I know Rick has done some studies there, but I think, yeah, it's interesting to look into it as a medication, and at the same time, these profound breakups or things that can occur are again
Breakthrough.
for some people.
Yeah.
Breakthroughs, yeah, exactly. You have the right word. Are for some people just too far away, or they're too anxious to experience. And again, for for 5-MeO-DMT, I would say it's important to be one-on-one. There you don't have, there it's really about that one person. Whereas, for example, vaping or DMT vape pen can still be used in social settings. So depending on that, the treatment would also need to be adjusted. But it definitely has potential.
Wow, that's incredible. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done. What can the common person do to either participate in research or to help to educate themselves?
Right. I would say, especially in the United States, it's very easy to follow the research when you look on the MAPS website or Johns Hopkins website, also UCSF. We are always recruiting for new trials. And then it's also worth following the researchers, whatever people are most comfortable with, like either on Twitter or maybe on Google Scholar. So you see when new research is coming out or when people are recruiting for studies, that's usually shared. Other than that, you can also get some of the newsletters, for example, Psychedelics Today, or join a Discord server with psychedelic seminars where a lot of people discuss all of the information there. We also have a newsletter with the Psychedelic and Entheogenic Academic Council at UCSF. I was hosting that over the pandemic and I did 58 meetings there and I handed it over to my group. So these are still meetings that are occurring on a bi-weekly basis. And if anyone has a study or anything to share, it's usually also the space where we can reach out and present about new studies. And then again, for other people who maybe in countries where it's less visible, it's always still a good idea to approach the universities or look up who's a researcher who is publishing in my country on that material, or people can obviously also reach out to us on the Global Drug Survey. Global Drug Survey is again online till the end of the year. We always ask people about substance use and also about psychedelics. We had a special module in GDS 2020 where we looked more broadly into psychedelics or use of psychedelics for self-treatment. And that's only a small number of people that we found. And oftentimes they would also do that with a partner or with a friend and not naturally with a psychedelic study, because again, only very few people have access to it. And we cannot forget that also sometimes the studies, for comparison reasons, they have an age limit. So if you're above 65, you cannot join a study, and there are obviously people interested above the age of 65, and that's another point. It's always good to also reach out to your local psychedelic community, like a psychedelic society or other people who are working on it. If you have a local chapter with Decriminalizing Nature or with the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, that's also a good ally, or people who are working on certain topics related, who can always link you to the right people. And no matter in which country you are, if you're watching this, you can obviously reach out to me and I try to help navigate wherever you need to go. There are a lot of good people working on a variety of topics, no matter whether you're interested in neuroscience or something more plant-based or community-based or in the jungle. And again, if you have time and financial means, to save money and then go travel, I would say South America is really a place to be at the moment. There are so many great retreats and people who are working with the local communities. And again, it's different, for example, in Peru, where tourism is allowed, versus Brazil, where it's much more hidden. But depending on which languages you speak, you can find something everywhere. The communities are growing worldwide, and yeah, a lot of people are actually looking into healing and what we can do, and they're trying to find new ways, and they hear about all these studies. But it's so important to notice that basically, also including you, you're perfect the way you are. It's like there is nothing to fix. There is just a lot of experience that we've gone through, a lot of standardizing and societal pressure that we grew up in. But there is a lot of healing that can be done without substances. We can focus on improving our sleep patterns. We can do breath work, we can do yoga, any kind of movement, ecstatic dance, everything that activates our bodies, that frees our minds. And again, be on the hunt for communities that are like-minded and interested in discussing these topics. So ultimately, I believe it's not about creating just more access to psychedelic medicine, but really about creating more access to places where people can explore themselves and interact with other people. So it is about connecting more to each other and also to nature. And a lot of these retreats, obviously in the jungle, bring us closer to nature and bring us to experiences that are not everyday life experiences. So that novelty seeking that is in all of us can also be provided in many other realms. And again, for people who have access to psychedelics, that may be a way. It may be a way, a one-time experience. For some people, it may be repeated. But again, what we want to have in the future is that those people who decide to use such substances as part of their healing can have an access to a safe environment and maybe a guided experience if this is what they're looking for. So that would be desirable for all of us.
So essentially, this is healing the world.
Well, we are healing the world.
We're healing the world by healing ourselves.
You and I and all the people who can forgive the other people that done harm to them, who can step up and move and step up again and again and again. And there is so much that is happening in our lives. We can only live right now for the present moment. And again, if we have an intentional experience with a psychedelic, that can help us during a time of transition, or it can help us to move on and distance from another experience that caused a lot of rumination in our minds, clearly. But
to put it behind us. Sorry, to put it behind us.
To put it behind us or take it with us, but maybe take it with us as a learning moment and put less weight on it, because oftentimes also traumatic experiences can be cause a lot of suffering for a lot of people. And it's not about denying that this experience happened, because it's part of our personality, but it's more like, where do I put it in myself? How much room do I give it? And how much room can I maybe free up for new experiences and new connections?
Beautiful. Wonderful. So if you're watching this and you like this video, give it a like, subscribe, leave a comment. You're supposed to say this stuff these days, you know? And how can we reach out to you, Dr. Maier?
Well, I'm obviously having an email that you can share, and then there is Instagram. I'm very active because I'm traveling. I'm sharing some content there. And obviously Twitter is a bit less active at the moment, but it's also a way to reach out. I'm happy to connect with all of you. I hope that also some of you I can meet in real life, because I think it's more important to be here now.
And to be present.
It would be great if you reach out and if you connect to each other. It's all about being present. I hope that we can also encourage a lot of real life connections. It's important for people to go out. We can research a lot on the internet, but the experiences are really happening outside of our comfort zone, most and foremost outside of our house door. So it's worth going out to nature and explore, and share every now and then a little bit of what we experience to inspire other people. But again, we can only share information on harm reduction and other things and education, but people have to do the experiences themselves. And oftentimes internet or online resources are great to share about these experiences, to come together also as support groups, or again, especially for integration circles, it can be great because we cannot always physically come together. But most and foremost, go out and enjoy the real life connections. Be here now.
Great. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Todd, and all the best for you.
Thanks. See you next time.
Bye-bye.